Hi everybody, welcome back to English 247. This is for our class on Tuesday, the 15th of June, where I wanted to talk about writing papers and also talk a little bit about persuasion. And as you know, we've been running behind by about a class or so, so I wanted to make some adjustments for due dates as well. But first, I wanted to discuss our discussion forum because one of you indicated that my replies aren't necessarily showing for the individual who posted their response. And I wanted to know if that was the situation that was happening with the rest of you as well, because my replies should be specifically directed to your specific response. So if they aren't, please let me know. And then there's something that I need to talk about with IT about adjusting settings. In terms of the writing assignments for Persuasion, which is journal number 2, that'll be due on the 17th, which is a Thursday, via PDF to my email. And you should have received journal number 1 back from me with comments at this point. So if you didn't, please let me know. In terms of my evaluating, I just basically responded to it as if we were having a conversation on paper. So I wasn't reviewing for grammar or mechanics, and I'm evaluating it on a checkmark scale. So a plus is excellent, and a check plus is very good, and a check is satisfactory. And I'm happy to say that all of the grades were in that particular area. There also is a less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. Occasionally you might get a split grade, which is something like a plus slash check plus, which means that it's better than a very good, but not quite an excellent. And what I would have done is I would have written comments. I hope they're legible. If they're not, please let me know because I will be happy to decipher for you about some of your thoughts and ideas in terms of Frankenstein. And if something occurred to me when I was reading that could be applicable for a paper, I would have made that reference as well. However, that said, just because I didn't make a reference to it, that doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't use your journals for your papers. And paper number 1 is going to be about a much more formal investigation of either Frankenstein or Persuasion. It could also be about Story of an Hour, which is how we began the semester. Keep in mind, though, that Story of an Hour as a short story is a very different kind of piece of literature than a novel is, so you would have to do a much more in-depth analysis. But that was my thinking for the first paper, which I will extend to the 24th of June for paper number 1, again, because we've been running about a class behind or so. Though certainly you can hand in assignments earlier. And the paper is meant to be formal, unlike the journals, which are informal. Approximately 4 to 5 pages long, double space, 1-inch margins, where you are talking about one specific topic and you're developing a thesis about that particular topic. Now, you'll remember that I had posted some suggested topics in our Moodle site. This is under the syllabus and other documents folder. And the topics are applicable for both paper number 1 and paper number 2, which is basically the same kind of exercise. The difference is that paper number 2 would be on the later set of readings. So paper number 1 would either be on Story of an Hour, Frankenstein, or Persuasion. And then paper number 2 would be addressing either Jane Eyre, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, or The Awakening. That said, Jane Eyre kind of straddles both paper number 1 and paper number 2. So if it turns out that you wanted to devote paper number 1 to Jane Eyre, you could certainly do that. But what you don't want to do is have 2 papers that are addressing the same text. And both of these papers are critical papers, or in other words, you don't need to be consulting outside resources. The idea is that it's based on your own interpretation and analysis, based on what we've discussed in class and your own readings. That said, if you have your heart set on a research paper, do talk with me because there is the possibility of negotiation. Just understand that a research paper is more than just compiling what others have said about a particular text. You still have to come up with your own original ideas. So you can choose any of the topics that I've listed, but feel free to adapt, combine, or dismiss. These are merely suggestions. If you choose to write on one of your own topics, I suggest that you briefly discuss the topic with me, and I hope you will discuss your topics and interests with me. And in relation to quotation, because you will need to quote from the actual text itself to support your arguments, we are using the MLA, or Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation. In other words, you are indicating a page number in parentheses after the quote. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a few more minutes. I suspect this is something that you would have talked about, or at least I hope you've talked about in other English classes. The syllabus talks about paper formatting specifications, which are pretty standard, that they are double space 1-inch margin papers. That would also include a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper that lists the title of your paper. So your paper should have a title, your name, my name, the due date, the paper number. And then the actual paper itself, the pages should be numbered. And in terms of length, this is merely a guesstimate, 4 to 5 pages. Your paper should be as long or as short as it needs to be in order to support your particular thesis. And everybody has the option of rewriting this first paper. So if the first paper is perhaps a little bit unclear to you because you haven't written a paper in class before, I see it as a kind of learning exercise where I will evaluate it both for grammar and mechanics as well as content and put a letter grade on it as opposed to a checkmark grade, which is what I did with the journals. And if you are content with your grade, then you're done. But if you wanted to earn a higher grade, you could do a revision by incorporating my comments. And certainly if you need further direction, we could always meet via Zoom or telephone, and I could give you further direction. And you would do a revision and hand in that revision along with your original and my comments, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but certainly the sooner the better. The idea is that the first paper is the learning exercise. The second paper is due at the very ending of the semester, so you wouldn't have time to rewrite it. That said, I have on occasion had students submit in their second paper early enough that they would have time for a revision. But the idea behind the first paper is that that's the paper that you can revise, and then the second paper you're just basically honing your skills from what you've learned with your first writing assignment. So I've given you some very general topics, as you can see with the paper topics that I've included, because the formulation of the thesis is basically up to you. But you can always talk about something like imagery. So you can isolate a central or particularly meaningful imagery, something like light and dark imagery, or animal imagery, or food imagery, and discuss one of the novels or short story in terms of that image and what it discloses. So for instance, we talked about imagery associated with freedom and rebirth in The Story of an Hour. Or you can examine a character. Examine one of the characters in one of the novels or in The Story of an Hour and his or her contribution to the text at large. Or perhaps you can examine a theme, some sort of major theme or issue that's examined in one of the texts. Revenge, suspicion, trust, death, love, power, justice. Compare and contrast. You can always compare and contrast 2 texts, but what you want to do is not necessarily have something that's so broad that you are basically limiting yourself, so that comparing something like Persuasion and Frankenstein, that's too broad of a topic. Now, if you wanted to compare the idea of female in Persuasion and Frankenstein, that's much more specific. And that would be something that you could do in 4 to 5 pages. Or perhaps you might compare 2 characters or 2 themes. Gender. And obviously, that's one of the major focuses of our semester. Analyze 1 or 2 of the texts in terms of gender or power relationships. How are the relationships between women and men, or women and women, or men presented in the world of the novel or the short story? And then on the bottom of this, you can see that I've got listed a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And that's a tall order. I once had a very wise professor in college say that a paper's never really done. You just have to hand it in at some point. But the idea is that in the time that you've got, that you are writing as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible. And that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of writing papers. I wanted to review some of the elements of writing a paper. You'll also see in the syllabus and other documents folder, I've included a handout, or I've included an attachment that's entitled The Critical Paper, which actually was given to me when I was an undergraduate student from one of my professors. And I still find it to be one of the best that's out there in terms of reviewing how to write a paper. And this critical paper is, again, based on your analysis and interpretations, not on outside research. And it's divided into 3 portions: the planning stage, the writing stage, and then finally the presentation or editing stage. And I can say that most students dive right into the writing stage without the planning stage, and that the planning stage is hugely important, and in fact will save you a lot of time if you spend some time just planning and thinking. In other words, trying to generate possible ideas, brainstorming about what you could talk about. And if you've ever had the situation where you're trying to write the perfect first sentence and basically you become frustrated because you can't articulate your first sentence and you don't get much writing done, then you know exactly what I mean. Better to begin with ideas. You don't have to worry about the construction of the sentences or the organization of those ideas. And then once you have ideas, you can begin to formulate sentences and paragraphs and think about organization. It's usually a much more time efficient way. And many times students don't even know necessarily what their thesis is going to be when they begin generating ideas. That's part of the writing process, is actually developing a thesis. I've had many students say that rather than beginning with the beginning of a paper, they begin with the middle of a paper, reread all of the ideas and thoughts that they have, summarize that in a sentence or two, and insert that in their introduction. That is their thesis. So you don't necessarily have to work chronologically. And again, part of the exercise of writing a paper is discovery about the text itself. But in the planning stage, you can see that you're told to analyze, not to summarize. Assume that the reader has some familiarity with the text. So basically what you are doing is interpreting for the reader. So you only retell those pieces of the text that are necessary to support your particular thesis. You don't have to retell the entire piece. Or another way of saying this, confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, emphasizing the main clause, the significance of that action. In other words, the major part of your sentences should be devoted to interpretation, not the summary. Begin with a strong and specific thesis that implies an interpretive conclusion about the work, and that's placed someplace in the first paragraph. The argument ought to be comprehensive enough to be important, but not so general or bland as to be meaningless. So, for example, saying something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. It's not a particularly good thesis because it's so general, it applies to every author and it applies to every text. We could insert in all of the texts of this semester and all of the authors and say the same thing. They all explore the complexities of experience. Or saying something like Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet, also much too broad. That would be something like Chopin employs much imagery in The Story of an Hour. The question is, what imagery has been employed and to what end? That is your thesis when you can answer those questions. Now, your paragraphs should be based on topic sentences, which is usually the first sentence of a paragraph that serves to summarize the paragraph. And that this does not have to happen for all of your paragraphs, but for most of your paragraphs. So if you were to do this, what you should be able to do is to read the first sentences of your paragraphs and have a kind of skeletal outline of your essay. This works very well too when you are reading a text, especially a textbook. If it's well written, not all textbooks are, you should be able to read the first sentences and basically have a sense of what the main points are. So, the topic sentences form the skeleton of your outline. The reader, too, should be able to follow the progress of your analysis by looking at the beginning of each paragraph. Support each of your points in your argument with analysis, reference to the text, and some direct quotation where appropriate. My job as a reader is basically to be a skeptic. So if you wanted to argue, let's say something to the effect of that Victor Frankenstein is very self-centered and selfish in the novel Frankenstein, as a reader, my response has to be to take the opposite position. No, he's not selfish and self-centered, even though I might have even discussed it in class. And then your job as a writer is to talk about how and why he's self-centered and selfish. And you do that by references from the text, sometimes through paraphrase, putting it in your own language, sometimes direct quotation, exactly word for word what was said. However, don't allow the evidence to take control of the paper. It is by definition supporting material. In other words, that you are making references to the text in order to support your particular analysis. So you aren't trying to pepper the text with quotation merely to give your paper length. The quotation is there because it gives a certain level of value to your arguments and serves as a defense to your arguments, which is why I'm less concerned with length and more concerned with product. Because a lot of times a student will hear 4 pages, and then what they do is they just add in enough quotation so that they've reached 4 pages. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they've got a good 4 pages of analysis. That just means they have 4 pages of language. So you want to be certain that what you are doing is basically creating an argument and defending that argument with as much or as little language and quotation as necessary. So we'll talk a little bit about being concise with writing as well in the next few minutes. But I wanted to review this idea of quotation, that generally ending a paragraph with a quote is considered bad practice because you usually comment on the relevance of a quote. Again, I'm talking generally speaking. There are always exceptions to every rule. And then you want to have some sort of a concluding paragraph. Don't merely alter the introduction. Try to save some impressive observation for the end. Perhaps relate at a hint at a related work, or another work by the same author. One technique that tends to work very well for the conclusion is relating it to contemporary times. Keep in mind that paragraphs should be at least 3 sentences and hopefully a lot longer, including your conclusion, which is usually where people run out of steam and usually where people run out of arguments. So you want to have a well-developed conclusion and introduction, as well as well-developed body paragraphs. And basically each paragraph addresses a particular topic, and that's determined based on your topic sentence, that first sentence of your paragraph. Now, once you've divided up your paper into paragraphs and you've got an introduction that lists your thesis, which is your position that you're taking about the work, and in your introduction, you should also list the name of the text and the name of the author, so it's very clear to the reader what it is you're discussing. Then your body paragraphs are basically your evidence, your support for, again, a reader who would be taking the opposite position, who would be skeptical. So you're making paraphrase and quotation from the text serve as your evidence for your particular position, so that your position is possible. Your position doesn't even have to be probable. It just needs to be possible. And then finally, you've got a concluding paragraph that gives a sense of closure to your writing, that isn't redundant or repetitious, but also is well developed. After that, you have to think about the construction of the sentences themselves, and that's the section about writing. The first principle of good writing is economy, and the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So the idea of trying to write well is to try to be concise and direct, which is difficult because we tend to use a lot more language than is necessary. So what you want to do is, after you've written out your paper, is you want to go through and you want to edit it. And you want to look at all of the sentences and ask yourself, can I rephrase this sentence in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if the response is yes, then 9 out of 10 times you should probably do that, that you should aim for trying to be concise. Now, that obviously comes at a cost. It means that you're losing length. But length should come from argument. It should come from ideas. Length should not come from unnecessary language. So, oftentimes what you'll see is that I will be crossing things out in sentences, either because they are redundant, because you've already said them, or because they can be rephrased in fewer words. It's one of the reasons why we suggest to students to avoid the use of I, because the assumption is that the entire paper is your thoughts, your feelings, your interpretations. So you don't have to say that I believe that Sir Walter Elliot is very pompous. You can just say Sir Walter Elliot is very pompous and take out the I believe, because the entire paper is about I believe. It's also one of the reasons why we ask students to spend a good amount of time in the editing process, which again, students oftentimes skip the planning and they skip the editing process because frankly, they've run out of time and they've run out of energy. So you want to be able to put your paper aside, hopefully for a few days and not look at it, but at the very least a few hours, and to try to view it with a fresh eye. Good writing depends on strong verbs and nouns. Adjectives and adverbs, the descriptive words, can be helpful, but you don't want to just insert them because you're trying to add length. And prefer the active to the passive voice, which means that you want to clearly have your sentence illustrate that the subject of the sentence, the subject is who or what is performing the action, that the subject of the sentence is clearly performing the action rather than the action is occurring to the subject of the sentence. For instance, Lillian graded the journals. The subject of the sentence is Lillian because Lillian is the thing, the person or the thing that did the grading, and the grading is the action or the verb. Here, this is an active sentence because it's very clear that Lillian is doing the grading. If you said the grading was done by Lillian, that is a passive construction, as if the grading is happening to me. But it also is a use of more language. Lillian graded the journals is 4 words, as opposed to the journals were graded by Lillian, 6 words. And again, trying to be as concise as possible, it would be much preferable to say Lillian graded the journals. If you do that with each sentence, you can see how it adds up, but then you've got a stronger piece of writing. And again, length comes from argument, not necessarily from language. Vary your sentences. You don't want to have a lot of short, choppy sentences in a row. You also don't want to have a lot of long sentences in a row. Mix long and short sentences. And vary your sentence beginnings as well, especially for sentences that appear next to one another. So you don't want to have 3 sentences in a row that begin with Victor Frankenstein. In other words, you want to try to vary your sentences. Again, a paragraph is a developed idea, so do not write 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, though you might see that in journalism, but journalism is a very different kind of writing. Avoid cliches. Those are overused expressions that no longer have any kind of originality to them. It's raining cats and dogs, for instance, or the grass is always greener on the other side of the lawn, or dead as a doornail. Use your own original language to say that. Ironically, if you ever take a Shakespeare class, you'll find out that many of these cliches, such as dead as a doornail, were created by Shakespeare himself, and they were original at the time, but they've been so used, basically individuals are quoting Shakespeare every day and they don't even realize it, that they're considered to be cliche. The idea also of avoiding slang in formal language, that you want to try to keep the language of academics or the language of business, both are the same, that there's a certain level of formality associated with that. Imagine being a second language student and trying to struggle with slang in addition to academic language. So when you use the word cool as a slang word, someone is a cool person, you use that in your language, but you don't necessarily use that in your writing. In your writing, you would say this person is interesting or engaging. So maintain the present tense. And this is something that I know you're going to be tempted not to do because these texts were written in the past and you read them in the past. But talk about them in the present as if they are happening now. This is what universalizes the text. So it isn't that Anne Elliot said. It's Anne Elliot says when we're talking about persuasion. And also the semicolon, I've noticed that students tend to fall in 1 or 2 groups about the semicolon. Either they're scared of it and they won't use it at all, and I think that's sad to be scared of a piece of punctuation. Or they overuse it because they think it's a cool piece of punctuation. The semicolon basically acts as much like a period does. It divides up 2 complete ideas or 2 complete sentences. The distinction is that the semicolon, unlike the period, is not a complete stop. It's a very long pause to illustrate a connection between the 2 sentences. Now, obviously, if if 2 sentences appear next to one another, they have a connection. But if you're using a semicolon, you're drawing the reader's attention to an even stronger connection. And you use this sparingly. So you don't use the semicolon in every paragraph, for instance. Perhaps 1 or 2 in a paper at most is enough. So Again, I encourage you to, experiment with pieces of punctuation, but the standard pieces of punctuation are commas and periods, not semicolons. And then you can see in the presentation piece that you want to avoid mistakes in previous papers. And this is where paper number 2 comes in. The idea is that you've done your learning with paper number 1, so when we get to the ending of the semester, you can just incorporate that into paper number 2. And it's why I'm allowing you the option of doing a revision, which is mine not really giving you anything. This is the way professional writers write. They go through the editorial process. You remember we talked about this very thing with Mary Shelley and how her husband Percy edited her text. So if you have difficulty when you are proofreading, difficulty concentrating, one technique you might want to try is reading backwards, starting from page 4 and then reading all the way to page 1, so that you can really concentrate on the sentences. And as I indicated, you want to take some time away from your writing so that you can look at the sentences with a fresh eye. Ideally days, but at the very least, at least a couple of hours. You need to have a title for your paper, and your title needs to be original. So you can't call your title, or you can't call your paper, I should say, The Story of an Hour, because this title has already been taken by Kate Chopin. Certainly, you can incorporate the author's title into your own title, something like Symbols of Freedom in The Story of an Hour, that you can do. Do note that short stories are put in quotation marks, and that longer works, such as novels, are either underlined or they are italicized. Identify, as I indicated, the author and the work someplace in the first paragraph. And to give you an idea how old this handout is, it says that instructors prefer typewritten papers. Obviously, you have to type, double space, provide that title page I was indicating that lists your name, my name, the due date, the paper title, the class. And definitely the paper is due on the date assigned, but you can always ask for an extension. So if you need additional time, let me know. And if you think about handing in early versions of the paper, I'm happy to review drafts as well and to give you some general commentary as well. And you can submit in that paper the way that you've been submitting in your journals via PDF to my email. And then what I will do is put comments on it and return it to you. If you are interested in some writing resources, and you can see that I've indicated this in the notes below, some of you might have heard of Purdue OWL. It's an excellent online resource that has been put together by Purdue University, but it's available for free for the general public, and it reviews the entire writing process, including things like documentation. In other words, how do you quote correctly? You can also see that I have reviewed in the notes, some of the things that I just talked about with you. And the citation we're using is the MLA, Modern Language Association, in-text parenthetical documentation. And basically you can see a example of that when I was talking about in paper topics that a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, and then I have a quote, have I, and then in square brackets, or has the author, and then close square brackets, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, close quote, and then open parentheses, and then I've got an author's last name, Biddle, page number 9, close parentheses, and then I've got punctuation. So this is the standard way of going through parenthetical documentation, that when you are quoting in a paper, you use quotation marks, and within those quote marks, you have to write exactly what was written. Now, if you're going to make changes, such as making an insertion, and usually we do an insertion because we want to clarify something. Usually it's a pronoun. So there might be a pronoun such as he in the quote that you're using, but it's unclear based on the quote if we're talking about Henry Frankenstein or Victor Clerval, Victor Clerval. So if that happens to be the case, or Victor Frankenstein, I'm sorry, and Henry Clerval. So if that happens to be the case, what you could do is in square brackets, put the name of the character. For instance, Frankenstein or Clerval, so that it's very clear to the reader whom you are discussing in your paper. And that square bracket is the reader's indicator that that did not appear in the original quote. And you can also delete a section of a quote because it's just not necessary. It's wordy or not important for your argument. Not because you want to completely change the meaning of the quote. That wouldn't be ethical. And the way you do that is by using an ellipsis, and those are 3 periods in a row. Again, you can see something like this in Purdue OWL, but I've also given examples in the notes below about using a square bracket for insertion and an ellipsis for an omission. And if you are quoting approximately over 3 lines of text or so, then you use a block quote, which means that you indent the quote. Usually you indent it by both sides so that it appears in the middle of the page. And again, I'm hopeful that all of this is review for you, but if I'm going too quickly, or if you needed me to go through some of this again, just feel free to contact me. And in terms of punctuation, just think of punctuation as kind of clues as to how to read a sentence. A comma is a pause, if you will. A period is a complete stop. So that said, the Purdue OWL site and also the GCC library site will also review certainly parenthetical documentation. And the way that the system works is that at the ending of the quote, whether you're done with the sentence or not is irrelevant. You, at the immediate ending of that quote, put in parentheses, at the very least, the page number of that particular quotation. And if it's not clear which author you are referring to, then you put the last name of the author. And if you've got multiple texts by the same author and it's not clear which text you're referring to, you give part of the paper title as well, or part of the novel title or short story title as well. So basically, within the parentheses following the quotation, you're writing the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to find that particular quote and verify its authenticity. And then at the very ending of your paper, you have something called a works cited page, which cites or lists all of the works that basically you've quoted throughout your paper, and that's listed by author last name. And this works very well with something like a research paper because you're using all kinds of outside resources. So the reader isn't necessarily familiar with the text that you are using. So for us, since we're running a critical paper, if you are just focusing on a particular text, let's say something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, once you've identified that you are referring to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein in your opening paragraph, then it is sufficient to just write in the parentheses, let's say the page number. You wouldn't necessarily have to give the name of the author or the title because that's the only text you're using. You don't even necessarily have to include a works cited page for my purposes because I'm well aware that you are using the text Frankenstein, even though you might be using a different edition than what I'm using. That said, you're free to include a works cited page, but if you do include your works cited page, you want to make sure that you're formatting it correctly. So there is a different way for formatting short story, let's say, than there would be for formatting novel. Again, you can find this in Purdue OWL or the GCC website or ask me, and I'll be happy to also direct you as well. But for my purposes, since it's a critical paper and I'm assuming that you've already done a works cited page in other classes, you wouldn't need to include the works cited page. So those were just a few of the points that I wanted to make about papers. I also wanted to add that while there's a little bit of controversy about this, I recommend that you avoid contractions, words like can't, don't, won't in your writing. Then instead you write them out. Do not, cannot, will not. It's considered to be a little bit more formal. It's not wrong to use a contraction, but if I do see a contraction in your writing, I will note it. So I feel that sense of obligation based on the way that I was schooled, which was a very conservative way. So you can never go wrong by avoiding contractions. So those are basically the major elements that I wanted to talk about in terms of writing. And I hope, again, that this is a review in terms of papers. And as you know, we are in the midst of Persuasion. And I had indicated last class that it is a complex novel because there are many characters, oftentimes with very similar names, so that you might want to keep a list of characters. And I included a list in my previous notes. I think that can be very helpful. You should also know that Persuasion is meant to be a very slow read to illustrate the kind of life that the landed gentry, the very privileged, basically live. There isn't a whole lot of action. Going on a walk is a major event. I don't know if you've gotten that far in the novel, but basically things of that nature. In other words, being able to leave your immediate vicinity and meet new people. Think about the fact that they didn't have technology the way that we do today, or the transportation options that we do today. And so your circle would be very small, especially if you were of a particular social class and you were expected to stay within that particular social circle, which is what we see with Persuasion. It probably is the slowest read of all of the books of the semester. So once we get to Jane Eyre, even though it's a longer book, and I encourage you to start Jane Eyre sooner rather than later because it is a longer book, things move much more quickly, and that's very deliberate. Because Jane Eyre lives a very different kind of life than the Elliots live. We're not supposed to particularly like the Elliots. Perhaps we can empathize with Anne Elliot, but certainly not with the other members of her family. In fact, if you think about the importance of the title Persuasion, where the author is trying to persuade us about some of the limitations associated with this particular lifestyle, the world of landed gentry, where there's a lot of leisure and the focus is on title, status, money, and property. In this way, Anne shows herself to be a rebel. But once we continue reading other texts in the semester, such as Jane Eyre and Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, we'll see that Anne doesn't seem nearly as rebellious. But unlike Frankenstein, what we've got is a central female character who serves as a kind of observer in the world going on around her. With these long classical sentences with very little action. This is basically the world that Anne is in. And we find out the importance of marriage, particularly for female, and marrying within or above one's station in terms of social class. We also learn a lot about the difference between female and male if they've lost their partner in marriage. We see this with Sir Walter, and we also see this with Lady Elliot, where Lady Elliot probably is not going to remarry. If you think about a Mrs. Mallard, she has a pretty good situation in that she has a certain level of status and autonomy and income. Because she doesn't have children, so she basically doesn't have any heirs, particularly male heirs. So she can be an autonomous and independent person in the way that Mrs. Mallard was considering her life to be before she found out that Bentley Mallard was not at all dead in the story of an hour. Sir Walter, this is one of the main issues in the text. Will he be remarrying? And it seems that his daughter is, his oldest, Elizabeth, is taking on a caretaking role, and that he needs caretaking in one way or another. And we find out about that very early on when we see that he basically has spent away his fortune. So while he has status, he doesn't have money, and he's trying to hide that from others and trying to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. And Sir Walter is very indicative of what happens with male widowers during the time period where they were very likely to remarry. And that's some of the suspicion with the Mrs. Clay as to why she's spending so much time there, that she might have her sights on Sir Walter. Again, not many people are aware of his financial condition. And still, his financial condition is quite comfortable. They still are able to afford servants and live in a rather desirable area, even though they have to let out Kellynch Hall, which is one of the major issues of the beginning of the novel. We'll see how different that is when we get to someone like Jane Eyre, how different her economic situation is, and how incredibly different that is from a Linda Brent or Harriet Jacobs. And we'll talk a little bit about the pseudonym when we get to that particular text. So the title Persuasion, you think about the meaning of persuasion, to gently influence. And this is very much a Victorian society that is concerned with manners and with appearances. And I do suggest that as you are reading Persuasion, you might also want to think about it as two separate books. I don't know if you've gotten this far, but the first part is where we focus on Anne and the Elliot family. And then the second part is where we see the Elliot family in their new locale and their new residence. So considering the time, that this has been a good 40 minutes or so, I guess I'll just stop here and next class talk more about persuasion. And then again, ideally what would happen is that your journal would be due midnight of that class, but certainly if you need additional time, please let me know that we've been running a little bit late. And we'll also talk a little bit after talking about persuasion, what's coming up, and that for us would be Emily Dickinson, which is going to be a way for us to kind of shift gears a little bit and find a Dickinson poem. That's going to be your assignment, by the way, when we get to Dickinson, is to find a Dickinson poem that you would like to share with your peers and talk a little bit about why you wanted to share that poem with your peers. Emily Dickinson wrote over 1,000 poems. Obviously, we are not going to be reading 1,000 poems, but I've got resources where you could look through some of Dickinson's poetry, and we'll talk a little bit about her writing and her background. And then we'll also talk about Jane Eyre. Again, our longest text, so it might require some time from you, but it will move very, very quickly, particularly in contrast to something like Persuasion. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with Persuasion. Take care. Bye-bye.